Hi, this is Fangirl Philosophizing, and the rise and fall of the damsel in distress archetype in comic book movies is kind of fascinating. It's an archetype we all like to make fun of, but removing them from our comic book movies is easier said than done. A little historical context. The damsel in distress archetype has been around since the dawn of fiction, pretty much, built upon the assumption that women could not protect themselves and that men were entitled to women in reward for their heroism. Gradually, society realized, only a few decades ago, that it's kind of unfair, and as our society has progressed, so has our media. Yes, men still save women a lot in movies, but the trope as a whole has fallen out and become fodder for satire and subversion.
I'm a damsel. I'm in distress. I can handle this. Have a nice day.
So, that's great. New day, new tropes, new writing, feminism, gender equality. But it does pose an especial challenge to the writers of comic book movies, whose movies are based on source material that were originally written in the early to mid-20th century, when it was fine to have your male protagonist repeatedly save his helpless girlfriend. So, damsels in distress were a sort of staple in early comic books, and even though comic books themselves have since evolved, that legacy still makes for a challenging adaptation process.
You have a knack for getting in trouble.
The only genre I can think of in a similar situation would be fairy tales, but with fairy tales, deviation from the source material is expected, even celebrated. You can change the characters and the story structure so long as you preserve certain iconic imagery.
Rapunzel, let down your hair!
And that's not enough in comic book movies. The original identities of the characters have to be preserved. Lois Lane is always a journalist, without powers. Gwen Stacy is always the police captain's daughter, and without powers. And yes, they changed Jane Foster from a nurse to an astrophysicist, but as a rule, changing the identity of a character, especially in terms of power, so the writers of these movies have to tell a story for a modern audience, but within the structural confines of the source material, which, for the most part, means that they are obliged to write about superpowered heroes and their non-superpowered girlfriends. And here's where avoiding the damsel in distress archetype gets tricky. So, you decide the trope is outdated, so you decide you're not going to make the love interest get kidnapped or put in jeopardy. What are you going to do instead? Because as sexist as making the love interest a damsel in distress is, it does serve two very important functions. One, it keeps the love interest relevant to the plot. Two, it provides the climax with emotional stakes. Mary Jane Watson doesn't have super strength and can't climb walls, so if she hasn't been kidnapped, what business does she have being in the climax? The Raimi films clearly answered that question with, she doesn't, which is why she gets kidnapped in every single film. In terms of emotional stakes, even when the world is in peril, the audience still needs some personal connection in order to care. Why are we upset that Lex Luthor's missile created a destructive aftershock? Because it's killing Lois Lane. If she weren't in peril, we'd be sort of detached from what's going on here. What I'm trying to get at is that it's not enough to just not make your woman a damsel in distress. You have to replace that with something else that makes her relevant to the plot and gives the climax emotional stakes. And this is something that I think the comic book movies released after Spider-Man 3 and before Marvel Phase 2 really struggled at. And it's difficult to talk about movie trends because different trends intersect and there are exceptions to every rule, but for the most part, the women in comic book movies released roughly between 2007 and 2012 had personalities and were strong and independent, but when the final showdown came, were either not there or added nothing. Except maybe emotional support. In Captain America, Peggy's fairly involved in the action until the climax, at which point she offers comfort to Steve as he prepares to sacrifice himself. In Batman Begins, Rachel plays a role in the mass production of the antidote, but in the climax she just cuddles young Joffrey Baratheon and figures out Batman's identity. Jane Foster stands and watches the Destroyer fight scene and isn't present at all on the Bifrost. Betty Ross watches from a plane and then convinces Bruce to spare the Abomination's life. And Lois Lane gets this awesome but ultimately pointless scene and can't even correctly put the thingamajig in. I will give Pepper Potts credit in the first Iron Man movie for pressing the vitally important button, and Gwen Stacy in the first Amazing Spider-Man movie for fighting off Kurt Connor's lizard. That was nice, but for the most part these movies seem to understand that the damsel in distress archetype isn't acceptable anymore, but they just don't know what to do instead. It's also worth mentioning that, to me anyways, the emotional stakes during the actual climactic fight scenes in these movies were kind of low. Except for Thor, which is an exception which I will get to in a second. And the reason I'm talking about this, the reason I think this is relevant, is because I've noticed something in the last few comic book movies that I hope isn't a fluke but an actual trend. And that's that superheroes and their love interests are collaborating to stop the bad guy. And I love that. Pepper Potts is actually the one who kills Killian Aldrich. Jane's gravitational anomaly detector and Thor's hammer Mjolnir are needed equally to defeat Malekith. Sharon Carter doesn't exactly work with Captain America, but she plays an important role in opposing Hydra. And though Gwen Stacy ultimately ends where she does in the comics, she and Peter work together to defeat Elektra. I love this on so many levels. First of all, the idea that Pepper set aside, you don't need superpowers to make a valuable contribution, is something that I like. But also, these women are integral to the film's climax, not because they're victims, but because they're actually moving the plot forward along with the hero. And in terms of emotional stakes, I personally think the best stakes come from the relationship between the villain and the hero. Which is why I think the first Thor film ultimately works despite its flaws. But even in movies where the hero-villain dynamic is dry, the fact that both our hero and heroine, who we both at least theoretically care about, are putting themselves in danger builds emotional stakes. The love interest is still in peril, just in the same way that the hero is.
Who's the hot mess now?
And so, as oversaturated as our market is right now with superhero movies, I haven't gotten tired of them yet, because the stories aren't stagnating. They're evolving and progressing and finding ways of replacing outdated tropes and reinventing characters while preserving their original spirit. And it's because of that that I genuinely look forward to what's coming next. This is Fangirl Philosophizing. See you next time.